What if I told you that the government's attempt to help families during the pandemic may be contributing to the working shortage right now throughout America? This may be the case with the SNAP benefits that the federal government has provided and the increase in benefits through the pandemic. So what is that impact on families, and what is that impact on small business owners? Anthony Hennen from the Center Square has covered this story and joins us today to break it all down. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. SNAP benefits are nothing new in this country, but during the pandemic, the federal government increased the benefits to families. Some are now saying that that increase, which is still in effect, is actually hurting the workforce and in turn hurting small businesses and middle income and even low income families throughout the country. It's a debate not just held here in our state of Pennsylvania, but in every state throughout America and in Congress as well. Anthony Hennen from the Center Square has covered the story, and he joins us today to talk about what this debate is all about. Anthony, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with very high level. SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is something that is different from WIC. So I think we often use food stamps. That's the old language for it. WIC provides specific types of food based on somebody's current needs. So for example, pregnant women get certain specific food through WIC. SNAP actually provides money that then families can utilize to purchase food. So 30,000 foot level, who is SNAP for and how does that work?
Yeah, I think generally SNAP is aimed at low-income families and generally working families as well, of getting some assistance on top of that. Okay. When you look at it's a federal program, so this is federal money, it's not state money. But essentially, I think as a national program, it's about $110 billion a year, something in that range. So it's a large federal program aimed sort of to fill a gap of if someone is working or someone in the family is working, but they might live in an area where they can't necessarily make ends meet. This is something to help them out and make that situation easier on them.
So it's supposed to be something like a fill the gap.
Yes, basically.
Got it. SNAP benefits were increased during the pandemic, right? How did this increase work? How much of an increase did we see?
Yeah, so the increase is basically tied to the federal health emergency, which is still in effect. Okay. Generally people are returning to the office as the pandemic fades away. But this is one of those things, along with some healthcare waivers tied to like remote telehealth, that sort of thing. This is one of those things that are still in place under the emergency declaration. So essentially, when you're looking at Pennsylvania, generally the average amount that's going to families, it's about $240 a month. But then with the federal emergency and the increasing how much gets sent out, I believe now it's about $450 a month. So it's essentially doubled for families receiving it.
The other thing that's been done is that there's a phase out. There's traditionally a phase out mechanism with SNAP, right? So it's like if you for every $100 you make past a certain threshold, they'll reduce your benefits by like $30 or something. That phase out has stopped.
Yes.
Is that part of this emergency declaration? Is because of COVID era policies?
Yes, exactly. I think generally when you're looking at programs like this since the 90s, 2000s, there's been a bit of a move away from having these kind of step downs and being replaced by these cliffs. Basically, when the funding was increased with the federal health emergency declaration, that sort of removed the step away. So yeah, generally it's about for every extra $100 of income someone would be earning, the benefits would be lowered by $30 as a way to make sure you're not discouraging someone from picking up more hours or taking a promotion or changing to a better job. Right. So you don't face these hard questions. But then when you remove that step down, you just have this benefits cliff. Any extra dollar you make over that income threshold, you lose the benefits entirely. So that's kind of the big issue here. It could be discouraging people from maybe working more when they have the opportunity, or taking a new job, or shifting, something like that.
So the phase out or the step down in some ways encourages people to continually improve their work or get a better job, and that you still get SNAP benefits to a certain degree, but what you're losing is actually less than what you're making in your additional work.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you don't want to pick up an extra 10 hours of work and getting a bit of an increase, but then you lose even more from the benefits you were receiving.
So this getting rid of this phase out, and you talked about the benefit cliff, right? And this idea that so now there's a threshold, and you have to be under the threshold to get benefits. Does this become all or nothing then? So if you're past the threshold, you go to zero?
Yes, and hence that's the big issue here,
okay.
right? Because when you're looking at this, we get hit with a pandemic that's shutting down the economy. You see a lot of rush to make sure employers don't just lay off people and go out of business. At the same time, you don't want to leave people just hanging if their hours got cut, or they are facing a problem as COVID-19 rolled through Pennsylvania. So it's not like this was necessarily intentional. This was just a trade-off between acting quickly and leaving people out to dry. The consequence, though, is that now we're facing this benefits cliff problem.
Right. So right now in Pennsylvania, or I guess it would be anywhere in the country, is a federal program. He said a two-person household that makes $3,502 monthly can receive $516 a month. If they make $1 more, so if they go from $3,502 to $3,503, they actually drop to zero.
Yes.
So I realize this has replaced that step-down model. Isn't it in some ways? I mean, first of all, if this is supposed to kind of be standing in the gap, it kind of fails to do that if you go to a benefits cliff. It feels like more people would actually lose out than be benefited.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is hitting when someone is close to that threshold, or close to that ceiling. So a number of people, if you're making $1,000 under the threshold and then you make $800 more, this doesn't come into play. So that's not. They're still essentially operating in like a step down situation. Whereas with this cliff, that's when push comes to shove, as it was.
And it just completely drops. There's no decline to benefits. It just goes to zero.
Yes.
Let me ask you this. In Pennsylvania, the statistics right now in our state, 101,000 more residents have gone on SNAP in 2022 since 2019, obviously before the pandemic. Monthly benefits have risen across for the state as a whole, spent $218 million in 2019, $456 million last year. And to your point, it was about $233 per individual, and now $456 per individual is that increase. It's been argued that this has affected employment. Talk to us about why and how that affects employment.
Yeah, so I think just the root issue here is that the benefits cliff discourages work in a way that the previous situation didn't with that step down. The previous situation encouraged you to take jobs that make more money. You'll lose a little bit of benefit, but you're still going up overall in
if
your
it's
salary.
$100 for $30, you're still getting $70.
Yes,
in benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a key issue of a lot of these kind of shifts, where you want able-bodied people to work. You want people to take those promotions they get or those job opportunities. Again, this is a federal program, so it's not necessarily state money. There's a bit of an administrative cost that's borne by the state and the federal government. But I think the bigger issue here, we talk about how much the government is funding this and how much taxpayer funds go into it. But I think the bigger issue is, you're trying to help families who are working. You're trying to encourage them to work. It might seem in the short term, giving them extra money could be good. But I think the issue here in the long term, if you have families, they're making a very clear decision of, do I lose out all these benefits or do I take on more work? And that might cause trouble for childcare. That might cause trouble for, if a son or daughter in the family gets a job, I can put them over, so then they can't do that. I think sort of a hidden issue here is that when you have something like a benefits cliff, you're not necessarily encouraging people to take a step for their career or for a step that can put them off. If you're just relying on these benefits 2 years during the pandemic rather than getting your foot in the door and working, that's a big problem. It's not just a big problem on the state government spending side. It's a big problem on essentially encouraging people not to not to make a better life for
Right,
themselves.
right.
And I think that's really something that gets undersold on these issues.
We have a whole conversation on the dignity of work, right? There's a dignity to being able to work and being able to contribute. And I don't just mean contribute to the economy, but to yourself, and which gets lost in all this. Do we see this issue when we're in that step down situation? Do we see things like SNAP discouraging people from working then? I mean, couldn't it be argued that if you get benefits, you don't want to go back to work? Even then? I mean, is this just more exasperated than it was, or do you see this as something that's significantly different than what the situation might have been before?
So I think it's a little too early to really say. I mean, clearly you have this disincentive to work simply because, it's rational. If in some cases, if you work, you're making the financial situation of your family harder.
Right.
So, it's hard to say these people are just, sponging off,
Sure.
public money or anything like that. So I don't think we'll really have a good fundamental empirical analysis of this for a few years more. But clearly, previous studies you've seen generally the bigger issue of a benefits cliff, or the more encouragement there is to stay on benefits rather than get a job or get a better job, you're going to see these effects. I think when you're looking at the labor force participation rate, Pennsylvania is an older state, and so I think I don't think it's clear that SNAP benefits are pulling people out of the workforce, but I think it can delay people from going into the workforce. Where we're looking at workforce numbers, I think a lot of this is simply an aging population, retirees, or people realizing there's a lot of stress going into working or running your own business. It makes sense to retire rather than put in another few years, and that could be the broader problem here driving labor force participation. Not necessarily SNAP itself as a major driver, but it's definitely a marginal one that we need to take into account.
I think that's a great nuanced observation. Is it contributing to it rather than is it the sole driver of it? A lot of things probably play into why there's a decline in the workforce, this being one of those additional factors. Anthony, thank you for that breakdown. We're going to go to the break. When we come back, we'll talk about the solutions that people from both sides of the aisle are proposing on how do we handle this. And so we'll talk about that when we come back.
Sounds great.
Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Anthony, thank you again for joining us. Let's talk about some of the solutions and where we think this is going to go. The Independent Fiscal Office, which is a nonpartisan office, they said, quote, while emergency allotments provide relief, they will also likely reduce the supply of labor, which is reinforced by expansion of the income thresholds. This is where we left off talking about this. You made an interesting observation when we ended the last segment. You said this isn't necessarily about families mooching off of the government. I think oftentimes that's the caricature that we make of it, but families are trying to make the best decision for them and their families. And so you're looking at, how do I maximize benefit for my family? And is that going to work, or is that receiving government assistance? But my family needs to eat. We need to be able to put my kids through school. And so where does that come from? And what you said the last segment is that while SNAP is clearly designed to help, it could also, or actually, be hurting those very families by not allowing them to go to work, potentially making more money, potentially you'll never discover unless you're able to go do it. And it seems like the Independent Fiscal Office is backing that this may, in the long run, in some ways, actually negatively impact the very people it's supposed to help.
Yes, I think the Independent Fiscal Office, they're very clear. They're not taking a position on the increase in SNAP benefits. They're just trying to explain the economic consequences of it. And there's clearly that disincentive to work as we move from a step down approach to a straight benefits cliff.
And to your point, from August 2019 to August 2022, those last 3 years from before the pandemic to now, there's been 110,000 employees lost just here in Pennsylvania. You mentioned earlier that it seems like SNAP may just be one of many factors. Our friend Greg Moreland from the National Federation of Independent Business says a lot of this also is driven by people who in the pandemic have taken a liking to working from home, and so now they're looking for different jobs. We know that there's been an increase of people who drive for Uber or DoorDash or Uber Eats, where they can kind of set their own schedule. How large of a role do you think something like SNAP or just government benefits in general are playing?
Yeah, I think again, it's hard to get a clear, strong number on this. I think especially the pandemic level effects, we'll get a better idea of this a few years down the road as people start getting more data and they can research this. But I think I don't think SNAP is a majority one, but I think it's definitely something involved when you're looking at either possibly younger workers, either delaying entering the workforce or not necessarily going from part-time to full-time or whatever else have you. I think SNAP is one of these issues. I think the aging population and retirement is another issue because this is also a national trend, right? I mean, these emergency benefits for SNAP, this is not just Pennsylvania. This is across the U.S. Across the U.S. again, we're seeing an aging population, so people are retiring more, and that makes them leave the labor force. And I think also just in general, Pennsylvania is not necessarily growing. Parts of Pennsylvania are, especially eastern Pennsylvania, you're seeing more migration either out of state or in state. But when you can't attract workers or you don't have as many younger Pennsylvanians coming up and being working age, you're definitely going to see that drop compared to 10 or 15 years ago.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. So this is just one of those contributing factors. Let's talk about solutions here. So first, President Biden recently declared that COVID is now over, and he wasn't saying that the virus is gone, but that the pandemic part of COVID is over. We now have the tools to be able to control and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 in the way that we couldn't in 2020. Yet that emergency declaration remains in place. Is there a reason why? I mean, did the president speak out and turn out? Even a lot of Democrats have been criticizing the president for saying this. Do you see that emergency declaration moving anywhere or going away at any point?
In regards to SNAP, I think it's hard to say, partially simply because SNAP is not necessarily a major issue on this. Biden declared the pandemic's over, but when you look at other hot button policies such as student loan forgiveness, then the administration is arguing that we're still dealing with the pandemic. So I think this is one that can kind of fall through the cracks. I think even if you do keep the emergency declaration in place, one fix to this could be reinstating that step down rather than having the benefits cliff. And so kind of trying to readjust that emergency declaration to make sure you're not discouraging work in this way. Even if you keep expanded benefits or a higher monthly benefit, there's ways of tinkering with the policy. But again, I think this is one of those issues that doesn't necessarily get people really heated up about for good or for ill.
One of the challenges that we often hear is that once you increase people's benefits, you can't really go back on that.
Yes, that's the other part of the equation.
Is this something where the federal government, and again, to your point, this is not something that a state government is doing, right? So this is, to our viewers, this is worthless to call your governor or call your state legislature. This is a federal government program, which means every state in the country is going to be impacted by this. Do you see a situation where they go back to the original funding levels, or do you think this is it now?
I think it's one of those situations. I think eventually, I think at least I'm relatively hopeful that the benefits cliff will disappear. I think I could see a situation where you keep, if not the current rates, at least readjusting them a bit lower, or tying them to the trade-off being tying it to inflation, and so you increase, so it's better off than dropping that out entirely. But yeah, I think it's really hard to say on these issues, right? What the federal government will do, even if it wants to do, this can move very slowly. Especially when you look at the job market now, where a lot of states aren't necessarily back up to the level that they were in terms of their labor force participation rate. But at the same time, you see, restaurants or jobs where you might expect people to be working and also receiving these benefits that are a little lower paying. There's a tight labor market for that sort of work. So even if that is discouraging work, you also have restaurants or employers or whoever else, possibly raising the wage or giving them better hours, flexibility, something like that to compensate. Because when you do need labor at a certain point, something's going to give. Sometimes that means a business will go under. Other times it means they'll just increase prices as a way to pull in more workers or cut hours. There's a lot of different ways for people to respond to
I think it's a great observation. I think a lot of times people think this happens in the vacuum, right? That we can just increase funding, but that something is going to give, right? So if people aren't working, something is going to give. Businesses are going to close.
Someone has to adjust.
Exactly. And I think that's a great observation, that oftentimes when we're tunnel visioned on a certain topic, we forget that there are implications outside of our tunnel. You mentioned earlier about restaurants. Often we see this all the time. They close or they're off certain days now. They're short-staffed. One of the responses, often from Democrats, is, well, pay your employees better. And this is probably one of the biggest solutions that we hear from Democrats, which is if we increase the minimum wage and we include more benefits with this, then people will have incentivized to get off SNAP or any of these government programs. Let's move it to $15 an hour. Let's move it to $20 an hour, whatever you will. Let's include healthcare benefits. We try this with Affordable Care Act. Let's include healthcare benefits for those who are part-time. We saw the response to that, which is employees just move the hours for part-time even lower. How viable is that? We've seen these proposals. Not all Democrats are on board with them. How viable is it to see a increase in minimum wage as a way of trying to get employees back in the workforce, and what's the drawback to that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it really depends on the industry, even on the part of the state you're looking at, because the wages are not the total cost of the employer, right? I mean, I think you have benefits, you have insurance costs, all these other things. So if you're a business and your competitors might go under because of effects of the pandemic, or if you do see a raise in minimum wage, you can adjust either by hiring fewer people, by adjusting working hours. Maybe rather than having 3 people working a shift that's relatively slow, you might only have 2. So on the employer side, there's a few ways to change it. On the other hand, though, as you see labor, being harder to hire people at certain wages, you've seen a lot of businesses already raising wages outside of any debates about the minimum wage. If the minimum wage increases, 8%, I don't think we're necessarily going to see a big effect from that. Whereas if you raise it to a point where the minimum wage is close to the prevailing wage, then you can see these trade-offs happen. You can see, it's when I think overall when you're looking at a state level, the percentage of workers who are actually earning minimum wage, it's not that high. So even if you would increase it, you're not necessarily seeing huge shifts in the labor force. Some people it might clearly benefit where they get a boost. Other times they might get a boost in pay, but they're not necessarily working as many hours. And so it can be really hard to suss out.
And to your point, that the threshold for SNAP is above minimum wage, and so plenty of people on it who won't be affected by a minimum wage increase. The Republican solution to this quickly is always that, or often that we should add work requirements to these benefits. That you can get on these benefits, but you need to show that you're looking for a job. Do you see that as something that could potentially happen, and what's the benefit and drawback to that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you look at a lot of these benefit programs, a lot of them already have work requirements, or SNAP is specifically tied to this, to the point where even the federal government sometimes phrases it as a public-private partnership, because you're getting government funds coming in to boost whatever the prevailing wage already is. SNAP essentially already has these sorts of work requirements. I think what you're seeing with programs like these in terms of solutions or any changes, the bigger problem is not people not looking for work. The bigger problem here is people not being they're being discouraged from taking a better job or from working more. And so, when you're looking at on that level, it's not really, I don't think it's coming into play very much.
I think it's a great assessment. Getting the problem right is incredibly important if we're going to find the solution. Anthony, thank you for joining us. Thank you for that breakdown and for explaining all of that to us and our viewers.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Anthony, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's talk about you for a moment. You're a journalist. You haven't always been a journalist. And you write for a group called the Center Square. How did you get into journalism?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of envious of some people because they have this whole story arc of like, I read this article or this thing happened. I need it. Like I don't really have an interesting backstory on that level. It's much more, I had always been very engaged with, literature, with history, with social studies growing up, and so it seemed just like the most viable way to kind of bring all my interests together and run from there. I think it's also just with journalism, there's not a lot of jobs where you can just randomly call people up and pick their brains or ask them about a certain issue. So it's very wide ranging. Where if I want to dig into something, I can, and I just really like having that opportunity.
Earlier we were talking, you said you went to Ohio University, not to be mistaken with Ohio State University.
Yes.
Or Bobcat. What did you study there?
Yeah, so I also journalism at Ohio University. It's script school, is generally well regarded. I also did a lot of economics as a specialization, and ended up in a lot of English classes, philosophy classes, that sort of thing.
Did you find that combination of doing journalism and something else, in your case economics, did you find that, or do you find that beneficial to your work today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at it, a lot of journalists, when they're studying it specifically, a lot of them might pull in political science or psychology, history. Those are generally fairly popular, at least from the anecdotes I've seen. But I think economics helps simply because economics is very wide-ranging and it's very applicable, not necessarily right on this specific current event of the day, but just the reasoning of, economics is focused on human action and human choice and what incentives exist to make people do A rather than B. And trying to understand, not necessarily, people aren't necessarily, the goal is not always motivated by, political belief, religious belief, anything else. It's just, the way that we can build some of these systems. The economic incentives drive people to do one option rather than the other, or it forces them to trade off between different values. And I think having that background really opens up some things.
What do you say to a young person, a high school student, maybe an early college student who's interested in being a journalist? What advice do you give them about what they should do now as they're a student in that process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would always embrace studying journalism directly, but absolutely, write as much as you can, get an understanding for how people view society differently, how people think based on their politics. But I think just the biggest thing is make sure you're reading good writing and you're practicing writing yourself and trying to find something that interests you and developing that as a beat.
I love that advice. Read good writing and then keep writing yourself. That's fantastic. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My thanks to Anthony Hennen from the Center Square for joining us. And thanks to each of you for tuning in as well. We hope to see you right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.